The afternoon sun was shining on the royal palace, and the grand courtyard was filled with guests who had gathered for a special event. The queen walked through the wide stone path with her usual grace, smiling politely at the guests. The royal guard stood in their straight lines, tall and still, dressed in their crisp uniforms. Their faces showed no emotion, as if they were carved from stone. It was a scene of tradition, order, and respect. Yet beneath this calm surface, something unexpected was about to unfold. Queen Camilla moved slowly toward the line of guards, her eyes studying them with sharp attention. Normally, she walked past them without a word, offering only a nod. But on this day, something seemed to catch her eye. She suddenly stopped in front of one guard. The air grew heavy. The crowd noticed her pause, and whispers began to ripple among the guests. She looked directly at the guard, and her voice, clear and firm, echoed through the courtyard. She accused him of misconduct. The words fell like thunder. The guard, who had been standing straight, was stunned but did not move. His name was Thomas, a man known among his colleagues for discipline and quiet strength. For years he had served with loyalty, never drawing attention to himself. Now the queen's voice carried an accusation that put him at the center of everyone's eyes. The guests froze in silence. Some gasped, others exchanged curious looks. The guards around Thomas remained still, but their minds raced. They all knew him well, and none of them had ever doubted his integrity. The accusation was sudden, and no one could understand what had led to it. Thomas did not speak. He simply held his posture, his eyes straight ahead as the queen's words hung in the air. A royal aide stepped forward quickly, sensing the tension, and whispered something to the queen. She waved her hand slightly as if brushing away his advice, and repeated her claim with even greater force. The atmosphere turned heavier. In the royal household, image meant everything. To accuse a guard in front of so many guests was no small act. The staff, who were trained to remain composed, struggled to hide their unease. The senior officials in attendance exchanged subtle signals, their faces betraying worry. They knew this was not a matter that could be ignored or explained away easily. The guard was immediately asked to step out of line and stand aside. Thomas obeyed without protest. His boots struck the stone as he walked forward with measured steps. He looked neither left nor right, though he could feel hundreds of eyes following him. He stopped at a short distance, his posture still firm, but his silence spoke louder than words. The queen's expression remained hard, but inside, she seemed unsettled. For a brief moment her eyes shifted, betraying a flicker of doubt, but she quickly regained her composure. She announced that the matter would be reviewed and that order must be maintained. Her words tried to sound final, but the air was already thick with questions. As the event continued, the whispers grew. Guests leaned toward one another, quietly sharing their thoughts. "What did he do?" one voice murmured. "I have never seen such a thing," another said. The palace staff moved quickly, guiding the event forward, but the mood had already changed. Later that evening, the royal household buzzed with quiet tension. Behind the tall doors and gilded walls, conversations whispered through the halls. Some staff members speculated about what the queen might have seen. Others defended Thomas, insisting he would never betray his duty. The guards who had stood beside him earlier spoke in low voices, remembering how steady he had been during every ceremony, how loyal he had remained during long nights of watch. In the city outside, the news spread faster than expected. A few guests who had attended the event shared their version of the story with friends, and within hours, rumors filled the air. Headlines began appearing in small corners of the media, asking why the queen had singled out a guard so suddenly. Reporters, always eager for a royal story, started gathering near the palace gates. Inside his quarters, Thomas sat in silence. His uniform, still neatly arranged, lay across the chair. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again. He had not broken protocol, not even for a second. He had stood exactly as trained, eyes forward, body firm. Yet the queen's accusation now threatened to erase years of loyal service. He thought about his family, who would hear about this through the media. His wife would worry, his children would be confused. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but he also knew the truth was on his side. The queen, in her private chamber, spoke with her closest advisors. Some encouraged her to step back quietly, to let the matter fade. Others said that to withdraw now would make her look weak. She listened, her hands folded, her eyes restless. She wanted to appear strong, but a part of her wondered if she had acted too quickly. The next morning, the royal household released a short statement. It simply said that an inquiry would take place regarding the Queen's concern, and that the guard in question would not be on duty until the matter was resolved. The words were polite, formal, and vague, but they did little to stop the whispers. If anything, they made the public even more curious. Thomas reported to the inquiry office, his face calm, his steps steady. He greeted his superiors with respect, though he knew many eyes were watching him with curiosity. Some believed him, some doubted him, but all were waiting to hear his side of the story. He remained silent for the moment, choosing patience over haste. In the palace dining hall, staff members ate their meals in uneasy silence. Servants who usually shared light conversations now avoided eye contact. The event had left a shadow over everyone. The guards, who had always been invisible figures of discipline, now carried a new burden. They wondered if any of them might be next to face such a moment. Queen Camilla continued her duties in public with her usual smile, but she could feel the change. People's eyes lingered on her longer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and doubt. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she had acted on what she believed was wrong. Yet the uncertainty inside her grew stronger with each passing hour. The first day after the accusation ended with unanswered questions. The palace, usually a symbol of order, now felt unsettled. Thomas, sitting in his quarters, promised himself he would remain calm until the truth was heard. He knew that silence could sometimes be stronger than words, and he believed the time would come when he could reveal everything. And so, the stage was set. The Queen had made her move. The guard had taken his place in silence, and the palace walls now carried the weight of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The story was only beginning, but already it had captured the eyes and ears of all who followed the royal family. The news of the Queen's sudden accusation traveled quickly, and by the following morning the palace was surrounded by curious eyes. Reporters gathered near the gates, photographers stood ready with their cameras, and questions floated through the air. People wanted to know what had really happened. Inside the palace walls, the royal household was in quiet chaos. Every member of staff was careful with their words, for they knew that one careless sentence could make its way into the papers. The halls that usually carried calm whispers of daily duties now carried tension like a storm about to break. Thomas, the guard at the center of this storm, woke early. He polished his uniform even though he had been told he would not be on duty until the inquiry was complete. Years of discipline could not be shaken off in a single night. His hands were steady, but his heart was heavy. He thought of his wife, who had looked at him with worried eyes when she read the first rumors. She had asked, "What will happen now?" Thomas had only answered with silence, but inside he was determined that the truth would clear his name. Meanwhile, in the Queen's private chamber, the morning began with hushed conversations. Her closest advisors entered one by one, bowing slightly before they spoke. They carried files, notes, and suggestions on how to handle the matter. One advisor suggested issuing a longer public statement to show confidence. Another warned that speaking too much might backfire, since the press was already eager to dig deeper. The Queen listened, her face calm but her thoughts restless. She wanted to appear strong before the public, yet a part of her questioned whether her decision had been wise. At breakfast, senior officials of the palace sat together. Their plates were filled, but their appetite was gone. They spoke in careful tones. "If the inquiry clears him, it will make Her Majesty look hasty," one official whispered. Another replied, "If she insists, the guard must be made an example. But the risk to her image is greater." These men and women had served through many storms in the royal household, yet this one felt different. It was not about politics or policy. It was about character, loyalty, and trust. Outside the palace gates, the public was forming its own opinions. Some defended the Queen, saying she would not accuse without reason. Others stood by the guard, arguing that years of loyal service should not be doubted so quickly. Social clubs, tea houses, and newsstands all buzzed with debates. For the first time in years, the royal family was not being discussed for ceremonies or celebrations, but for a conflict that touched their dignity. Inside the inquiry room, Thomas faced his first round of questions. A group of senior officers sat across from him, their faces serious. They asked about his conduct during the event, about every movement, every detail. Thomas answered calmly, his voice steady, his answers short but clear. He insisted that he had followed every rule, every order. His honesty impressed some of the officers, though others remained cautious. They knew that the Queen herself had spoken against him, and that carried a heavy weight. After the session, Thomas walked out of the room, his boots echoing in the hallway. Other guards glanced at him, some nodding slightly as a sign of respect, others looking away to avoid being noticed. Thomas carried himself with the same dignity he always had, though the eyes of doubt still followed him. Later that day, the palace issued another short statement, confirming that the inquiry had begun and that no conclusions had been made. The statement was carefully worded, but it failed to satisfy the public. If anything, it only made the story grow larger. Newspapers printed bold headlines, television programs invited experts to speculate, and ordinary citizens began to wonder if the palace was hiding something deeper. Queen Camilla appeared at a charity event that evening. She smiled at the cameras, shook hands with guests, and spoke about her cause, but the questions never left the air. Reporters shouted as she walked to her car, "Your Majesty, what about the guard?" She did not answer. Her silence made the headlines the next morning. Queen refuses to comment became the news story, and her reputation, once carefully guarded, began to face cracks. Back in his modest home, Thomas's family struggled with the sudden attention. His children asked their mother why people at school whispered about their father. His wife tried to protect them, saying, "Your father is an honest man. This will pass." But inside, she carried the same worry as everyone else. Each time the phone rang or a neighbor knocked at the door, her heart raced. Inside the palace, conversations grew sharper. Some officials believed the Queen had acted on impulse, misreading a situation. Others thought she might have had personal reasons, perhaps frustrations from within the royal household itself. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. The matter had left the walls of the palace and entered the court of public opinion, where control was nearly impossible. The inquiry continued quietly. Witnesses were asked about the event, from staff members to other guards. Some admitted they had seen nothing unusual. Others said the Queen had appeared unsettled even before she made the accusation. Piece by piece, the story began to shift, and the guard's image seemed less guilty than before. One evening, as Thomas walked alone through the palace garden, a young servant approached him. The boy looked nervous, glancing around before speaking. "Sir, I believe you," he whispered. "I was there. I saw you. You did nothing wrong." Thomas looked at him with calm eyes and simply nodded. He did not need the words, but they brought him a quiet sense of comfort. Meanwhile, the Queen spent her evenings in silence. She walked through her private rooms, her mind heavy. She knew that every decision she made would be remembered, written down in history. She had wanted to appear strong, but now she feared she had given her critics a weapon. Yet pride stopped her from stepping back. She could not admit fault so easily, not as Queen. As days passed, the weight of the event grew heavier. The palace's silence allowed the rumors to grow, and the public's curiosity only deepened. Thomas remained patient, holding his dignity, waiting for the right time to speak. He knew the truth was on his side, and he trusted that in the end the truth would be stronger than any accusation. The second part of the story closed with the palace trapped in a web of its own making. The Queen stood on one side, holding firm to her claim. The guard stood on the other, silent but unshaken. Between them stood a nation watching closely, waiting for the truth that could either protect the throne or shatter its image. The inquiry room was silent when Thomas entered again. The long wooden table stretched in front of him, and on the other side sat the senior officials waiting to hear more. Their faces showed no emotion, but their eyes were sharp. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, a reminder of the seriousness of the moment. Thomas took his seat, back straight, hands resting calmly on the table. He had spent many sleepless nights thinking about this day. It was no longer just about defending himself. It was about protecting the truth. One of the officials spoke first, his voice steady but pressing. He asked Thomas why he thought the Queen had accused him. For a moment, Thomas remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the table. Then he lifted his head and answered in a calm voice. He said he could not speak for the Queen's mind, but he could speak for his own actions. He had done nothing wrong. Every order he followed came directly from the palace, and he had never once broken protocol. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were steady. The officials leaned closer. They wanted details, not just words of loyalty. That was when Thomas made a decision he had been holding back. He reached into a folder he had brought with him. Inside were records, reports, instructions, and documents he had carefully kept over the years. These papers were not meant for the public, but they showed something important. They revealed that many actions the guards took were not their own choices, but direct orders from the palace itself. The officials exchanged surprised glances. They had expected him to defend himself with simple words, not with proof. Thomas explained how guards were often given special instructions for certain events. He showed signed orders that detailed movements, gestures, and positions. His voice never rose, but each word cut through the silence like a blade. He was not only defending himself, he was opening a door to secrets hidden inside the palace. The room grew tense. One officer leaned back, folding his arms, his eyes narrowing. Another wrote notes quickly, as if afraid the words would disappear if not captured. Thomas spoke about his years of service, how he had seen both loyalty and fear inside the palace. He did not accuse anyone directly, but his words hinted at truths that challenged the Queen's version of events. Outside the inquiry, whispers grew louder. A few staff members who had seen Thomas enter with his folder spread the word. "He has evidence," they said quietly to one another. Soon, even the servants carrying trays through the corridors repeated the rumor. By the end of the day, half the palace knew that the guard was not silent anymore. He was speaking. The Queen was informed almost immediately. Her advisor entered her room with a grave face and told her what had happened. For a moment she froze, her teacup resting halfway to her lips. She asked him to repeat it, as if she could not believe her own ears. When he confirmed, her face hardened. She realized that her accusation had given Thomas the chance to reveal things that might never have come out otherwise. In the city, the press caught wind of the development. Although the inquiry was supposed to be private, information always found a way to slip out. Articles appeared with titles like "Guard Brings Documents to Inquiry" and "Palace Secrets at Risk." People gathered in small groups talking about what this could mean. Some began to doubt the Queen's strength, saying she had underestimated the loyalty of her own guard. Others admired Thomas for his courage, calling him a man of honor who stood against power without fear. Meanwhile, Thomas's family felt a shift. His wife, who had been worried and silent, now walked with her head higher. Neighbors who had once looked at them with suspicion now whispered words of support. His children, still confused by the sudden attention, began to understand that their father was not simply fighting for his job, he was fighting for the truth. Back in the inquiry room, the questions grew sharper. The officials asked Thomas why he had kept those records for so long. He explained that discipline taught him to note every order, every instruction, every detail. He had never expected to use them, but he believed it was his duty to keep a record of his service. His answer impressed some of the officials, though it also worried them. Records like these, if seen outside the palace, could cause damage. For the first time, the Queen's accusation appeared weak. Instead of proving guilt, it had opened a window into hidden practices that most people never saw. Some officials began to wonder privately whether protecting the Queen's image was worth more than the truth. Others feared that if Thomas's evidence became public, it could change how the nation viewed the entire royal household. One night, as Thomas returned to his quarters, he found a letter slipped under his door. The paper was plain, the handwriting neat. It said only a few words: "Stand firm. Many are watching." He did not know who had written it, but the message gave him strength. He folded the paper and placed it inside his folder of documents. The Queen, however, faced sleepless nights. She walked through her private rooms, the golden lamps casting long shadows on the walls. She thought about the guard, about the inquiry, about the whispers in the city. She had always been careful with her image, shaping it with patience and grace. But now, one accusation, spoken too quickly, had given rise to a storm she could not easily stop. Her pride told her to continue, but her heart warned her that the truth would not remain buried. As the inquiry moved into its next stage, Thomas continued to answer every question calmly. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, never insulted the Queen. Instead, he let the document speak for him. Each piece of evidence drew the officials deeper into a reality they could not ignore. The Queen's accusation seemed smaller with every passing day, while the guard's dignity grew larger in the eyes of those who watched. By the end of that week, the story had reached a turning point. The guard was no longer just defending himself. He was uncovering truths that the palace had kept hidden for years. The queen's image, once polished and admired, began to show cracks. People who had never questioned her before now whispered doubts. And so the inquiry that began with a simple accusation transformed into something far greater. It was no longer just about a guard accused of misconduct. It had become a test of honesty, loyalty, and power. The queen stood on one side, her pride unbending. The guard stood on the other, armed with truth and patience. Between them, the palace walls echoed with the weight of revelations that could not be silenced forever. The palace had always been a place of control, a place where silence was as important as gold, but now that silence was breaking. Thomas's quiet but steady words from the inquiry were spreading beyond the walls, and his documents were being spoken of in whispers that could not be stopped. The queen, once certain of her strength, began to notice the shift around her. Courtiers who had always smiled too quickly now avoided her gaze. Advisors spoke in careful tones, weighing each word as if they were afraid of stepping onto thin ice. The air inside the palace was heavy, filled with questions that no one dared to ask aloud. The inquiry continued in private, but privacy was an illusion. Every evening some detail slipped out, carried by a servant's quiet word or an official's nervous glance. Outside the gates, reporters waited, ready to catch even the smallest piece of news. The public's curiosity grew restless. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what the guard had revealed. Inside the queen's chamber, a long meeting was held late into the night. Her senior advisors sat with her, their faces lined with fatigue. One warned her, if the documents are seen by the public, they could raise doubts about the entire household. Another said, Your Majesty, if you continue pressing this case, you risk greater damage to your own image. She listened without reply, her eyes fixed on the flickering light of the fireplace. She had always believed that a queen must never step back once a claim was made, but even she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Thomas, meanwhile, remained calm. He continued to appear before the inquiry, bringing more details each time. He spoke not of rumors, not of emotions, but of facts. Orders signed, instructions delivered, records kept. He did not accuse anyone directly, yet his evidence painted a picture that made the queen's claim seem smaller and smaller. Those who once doubted him now began to respect him, not just as a guard, but as a man of courage. The palace staff whispered his name with a kind of quiet admiration. Servants who had once avoided his family now greeted them kindly. Other guards stood taller when they walked beside him. Even officials who were careful with their expressions showed him small signs of respect. It was as if his dignity had become a shield not only for himself, but for everyone who believed in fairness. The queen, however, could feel her position weakening. Each public appearance became more difficult. At a charity event, she smiled as she always had, but she felt the difference. The applause was polite, but the eyes watching her carried questions. A reporter shouted across the crowd, Your Majesty, will you address the guard's evidence? She walked past without answering, her face frozen in calm, but inside her heart pounded. The newspapers became bolder. One headline read, Guard's Truth versus Queen's Word. Another asked, Is the palace hiding more? Editorials filled the pages, some supporting the queen, others questioning her judgment. The royal household, which had always managed to control its image, found itself struggling. One evening, during another inquiry session, Thomas revealed something that shook the room. He explained that he had been ordered to follow specific protocol on the day of the event, instructions that had come directly from higher officials. He presented written proof signed and stamped. The officials at the table leaned forward, their eyes widening. This was no longer about a guard's word against a queen's claim. This was about the system inside the palace itself. The revelation caused a wave of alarm. Senior advisors rushed to the queen's side, warning her that continuing the accusation could expose more than she intended. She grew frustrated, her voice sharp as she told them she could not admit fault. Yet even as she spoke, she knew the truth was pressing closer and closer to the surface. In the city, people began to see Thomas not just as a guard, but as a symbol. He became the quiet face of honesty, standing against the highest power. Discussions filled cafes, homes, and workplaces. Some said he was brave, others said he was foolish, but no one could deny that his patience and dignity had captured the nation's attention. Within the palace walls, tension grew unbearable. Guards at their posts stood stiff, but in their minds they wondered what would come next. Servants tiptoed through corridors, careful not to speak too loudly. Even the royal family felt the strain, their private dinners quieter than ever. The Queen's presence at the table, once a source of calm, now carried unease. Thomas himself remained unchanged. In his quarters, he kept his folder of documents neatly arranged. At night, he sat by the window, looking out at the dark garden. He thought of his family, of the life he had chosen, of the oath he had taken. He knew the inquiry was no longer just about him. It had become larger, something that touched the very heart of the palace. The turning point came during one heated session when a senior official, unable to contain his frustration, admitted that some of Thomas's claims were true. The room fell silent. No one had expected such words. Even Thomas, calm as ever, felt the weight of the admission. It was proof that the truth could not be buried forever. When the news of that admission slipped into the outside world, it exploded. Newspapers printed it in bold letters, television screens repeated it, and people across the country talked of nothing else. The guard was right, one headline declared. Cracks in the palace, said another. The Queen's image, once untouchable, now seemed fragile. In her private room that night, she sat alone. The crown on her desk gleamed under the soft light. But to her it looked heavier than ever. She thought about the day she had made the accusation, the certainty she had felt, and the pride that had guided her. Now she wondered if that pride had been her greatest mistake. The inquiry was not yet over, but the story had already turned. The guard was no longer seen as the accused. He was seen as the truth-bearer. The Queen, no longer in full control of her image, faced a storm that could not be silenced with smiles or ceremonies. The palace halls, once filled with the calm rhythm of tradition, now carried the restless sound of change. The inquiry was still ongoing, but its impact had already begun to reshape how people saw power, loyalty, and honesty within the royal walls, and so, as Part 4 drew to a close, the story had reached its breaking point. The Queen's accusation had opened a door she could not close. Thomas's revelations had shaken the very foundation of her image. The nation waited breathlessly, wondering what the final outcome would be. Would the truth be fully revealed? Would the Queen recover her standing? Or had her image already been shattered beyond repair? The inquiry stretched on longer than anyone expected, but the final sessions carried the greatest weight. By this time, the Queen's initial accusation had already lost its sharpness. What had once sounded powerful now felt like an echo of something uncertain. The nation had watched the guard, Thomas, walk through each stage with quiet dignity, and the more he spoke, the more his voice carried truth. Each detail he revealed had been steady, each document carefully placed, and each answer calm. The officials sitting across from him could no longer deny that his words carried strength. The palace tried to manage the storm. Statements were released with careful wording, but they only fueled more questions. People wanted honesty, not polished phrases. The Queen, still unwilling to step back, avoided every attempt by the press to draw her into conversation about the guard. Her silence, once seen as regal, now appeared as avoidance, and in the hearts of the people something began to shift. The final day of the inquiry was held in a grand hall that had seen centuries of history. Heavy curtains framed the tall windows, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the marble floor as officials and advisors filled their seats. The Queen herself did not attend, but her presence lingered in every corner. Everyone knew that the outcome would touch her image as much as the guards. Thomas entered the hall with the same calm posture he had carried since the beginning. His boots tapped softly against the floor, and he carried his folder under his arm. He stood before the table, waiting for the questions. One of the senior officials cleared his throat and asked if he had any final statement. The guard opened his folder, but instead of handing over more documents, he spoke. His voice was firm but gentle. He said he had served the palace with loyalty for many years, never seeking attention, never desiring recognition. He had followed orders faithfully, even when those orders were difficult. He explained that he had been accused publicly of misconduct, but he had chosen not to fight with anger. Instead, he believed the truth should speak for itself. And now, he said, the truth was clear. The room fell silent. Even those who had doubted him could not ignore his words. His calmness, his patience, and his honesty stood taller than any uniform. He bowed slightly, placed his folder on the table, and stepped back. His part was finished. When the officials finally gave their conclusion, it was quiet but powerful. They cleared Thomas of all wrongdoing. They stated that his conduct had been in line with palace orders and that no evidence of misconduct could be found. The inquiry was over. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines appeared across the country. Guard cleared, truth revealed, palace faces questions. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, some cheering his name, others simply talking with wonder about how a single guard had stood against such power. In living rooms and workplaces, people repeated the story, pointing out how his patience had been stronger than pride. For Thomas, the relief was heavy but bittersweet. He returned to his quarters that evening, sitting quietly by the window. His wife embraced him with tears in her eyes, and his children clung to him as if afraid to let go. Neighbors visited, offering words of support. He smiled politely, grateful for their kindness, but in his heart he knew life would never return to the quiet routine it had been before. His name was now known far beyond the palace gates. The queen, on the other hand, faced a different world. Though she continued her public duties, the weight of doubt followed her. At events, her smiles seemed thinner, her steps slower. She could feel the change in the air, the shift in how people looked at her. She had once been untouchable, but now her image carried cracks that could not be hidden. The accusation she had made, meant to show strength, had instead revealed weakness. Behind closed doors, the royal family tried to recover. Advisors spoke of strategies to rebuild her reputation. Some suggested more charity work. Others proposed carefully crafted interviews. But no matter the plan, the memory of the inquiry lingered. People remembered the sight of the guard standing tall, presenting his documents, speaking with calm honesty. That memory was stronger than any crafted words. Within the palace, whispers continued. Some staff admired Thomas, calling him a man of principle. Others feared what his example might inspire. If one guard could reveal hidden truths, perhaps others might as well. The atmosphere of control that had long defined the royal household no longer felt complete. Thomas himself was offered reinstatement, and though he accepted, he knew he returned not as the same man. He was no longer just a guard in the background. He had become a figure of respect, someone whose silence and dignity had spoken louder than any accusation. His colleagues treated him with new regard, some saluting with extra firmness, others offering quiet nods of respect. The queen avoided speaking of him, but his presence could not be ignored. Each time he stood in uniform at a ceremony, the public saw not just a guard but the man who had faced a queen's word and emerged with truth. In their hearts, many admired him more than some of the royals themselves. Over time, the storm began to settle, but its mark remained. The palace moved on to other matters, new events, new stories, but the memory of the inquiry stayed alive in whispers and writings. People remembered the lesson it carried, that even within the walls of great power, honesty could not be silenced forever. For the queen, the experience left a scar. Her name was still spoken with respect, but it was not the same as before. Where once there had been unquestioned admiration, now there was quiet doubt. Her image had been shaken, and though she continued her duties, she carried the shadow of that day when a guard stood against her. For Thomas, life continued with both peace and burden. He walked his post, stood his watch, and carried out his duties with the same discipline as always. Yet he knew he was no longer invisible. People watched him differently, with eyes that carried recognition. He had not sought fame, but it had found him. And so the story reached its end, not with loud celebration, but with a quiet truth. A queen's accusation had turned into a trial of honesty. A guard's silence had turned into a shield. And in the end, the truth had shattered an image built over years. The palace walls still stood, but the story of Thomas, the royal guard, lived on as a reminder that no power, no matter how high, could stand untouched when the truth was revealed.